Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. I'm going to give you a little talk on the journey to net zero, and specifically the sorts of things now that might be seen as things that might be preventing us from getting there. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name's Stephen Lowndes. I'm with the Carbon and Energy Fund as Technical Director. I was trying to think back when I was putting this together how long I've what was the earliest hospital scheme I ever got involved with. I think, if my memory is accurate, it would have been Harefield Hospital, and being involved in the design of the paediatric wing refurbishment scheme. And I think I was sizing radiators or something very menial at that time. So I have quite a long career, not all of it in hospital design, but a good amount of it in public services projects. And with the CEF, I've got a specific eye on performance. As you know, the CEF are operating schemes that guarantee savings, and so part of my role is to be involved in ensuring those things happen in accordance with the contract. But I do have a passion for net zero and helping the NHS get on that journey towards meeting the 2040 target. So you've seen loads of these graphs. I'm pretty sure if you've been at one or two of these sorts of presentations, and just looking generally through the NHS net zero guidance, what it's showing is that, in essence, if we do absolutely nothing, and this is a typical hospital trust, that we will decarbonise, and that will be largely based upon the electricity grid decarbonising on our behalf. So in some ways we could decarbonise and do absolutely nothing, but actually, and this is quite a good example, if we do nothing we won't hit our NHS targets. So we've got a sort of intermediary target between 2032 and 2028 and 2032, and we've got to try and hit 80% of the way towards our net zero target. We won't be able to, in most instances, rely on the decarbonisation of the grid to do that. And in fact, what's probably preventing most trusts from getting beyond just relying on the grid is that fossil fuel gap. It's heat decarbonisation. And we've got to tackle that if we're going to go forward and get anywhere near towards net zero. Now you notice that this graph shows the red line going all the way down to zero, but net zero doesn't necessarily mean zero. It means as close and as practically that you can practically get towards that zero. Now, lots of people will probably now be looking at this and thinking, well, there's lots of reasons why we probably won't be able to do it or can't be able to do it. And the main reasons are probably money. We've enjoyed PSDS funding in the last few years, which has been excellent at kick-starting some really good schemes, and some of these have been presented earlier today and yesterday. But there's no more PSDS money. That's now not an option. And so actually we're sort of thinking, well, how on earth then can we afford to do it? We don't have any spare capital knocking around. And even if we could, if we have to start moving our heating away from gas and start moving it over to electrical energy, then the chances are we might feel we can't actually afford to operate the plant because of the big discrepancy between or disparity between natural gas and electricity prices. And even if we said, well, we're prepared to take a little bit of a hit there, the other main reason might be that it gets very complicated when we start to move away from fossil fuels, particularly if we're going to rely on electric heat pumps. We might need to do stuff with our infrastructure that would also mean lots of expense and maybe takes some time to do. So it starts to get quite complicated. So what I'm going to show you next is a series of slides which show the various mainstream routes that people are currently thinking of using to help decarbonise heat. Now, these slides are going to show some costs. They're going to show some cost ranges, and I've taken those where I can from the library of CEF projects that we've done in recent years, and also ones that we've sort of got in the wings awaiting implementation. As such, what I've also tried to do is take away some of the added complexities to those costs, because no project is the same from one project to another. But you can start to see some trends once you take out some of the project particulars that are driving the reason why some technology is costing X on one scheme and Y on another. Nevertheless, I want you to take these numbers as fairly generic. They're not necessarily the cost that you would pay on your scheme. So here I've got a very simplified heat pump project, and what it's trying to do is to replace a portion of the hospital's site demand. And this assumes that it's relatively straightforward to place a heat pump on the site and connect it up to the trust heating system. And if we were to do that, for each megawatt of heating that we want in terms of capacity of plant, the upfront capital is going to be somewhere around 1.7 million for a very, very simple heat pump scheme. So that's about 1.7 per megawatt. Now that means that obviously if you're going to put that through your books as a trust, that 1.7 million is going to sit on your balance sheet. Now, next to the trust funded option, I've shown an off-balance sheet solution through some form of energy service contract. So if you were to put that 1.7 million value of heat pump, there wouldn't be an immediate 1.7 million of capital needed to sit on your balance sheet straight off like this. Now then, the saving that that solution delivers is going to be usually negative. I'm going to show you how that varies depending on what the scheme looks like, but it will essentially be a negative value. And obviously what you're doing there is, okay, you're taking a hit on revenue and you're taking a hit on capital. And the aim of that is to save carbon. So I've shown the carbon savings typically per megawatt down below on the table below. And as a sort of investment in saving carbon, typically you might be looking around about £100 per tonne for a very simple, no complications heat pump scheme. But we all know life is not simple and things aren't very, often or not, there's usually stuff that happens that makes projects more expensive than they should be. And with heat pumps, it's usually there's some form of limit on how big you can put a heat pump in without having to do something to your electrical infrastructure. So as soon as you start having to reinforce that infrastructure, you're immediately going to be adding more capital to this project. And you can see on this example, again, this is per megawatt. So the bigger the heat pump, you just keep multiplying out these numbers and they get bigger and bigger. So I've ended up with spending more capital, but I'm not saving, I'm still delivering the 1 megawatts worth of heat. So my value now is starting to get worse in terms of against measuring against business as usual. Now, I say all of these are measuring against what you might currently be doing, which 9 times out of 10, we would be measuring this against some form of gas boiler installation, i.e. what we've already got. And you might argue that, well, maybe that's a little bit unfair, but in most business cases, unfortunately, that seems to be what we have to measure against. So business as usual is, in effect, doing nothing. So all of these are showing that if we assume that doing nothing is not an option, it looks like we're going to have to take a hit on our revenue. Now, not only are we probably unlikely to be able to take a very big heat pump without doing anything on the electrical infrastructure side, the chances are we can't use that heat from the heat pump, particularly if it's an air source heat pump, without doing something to our heat side. And usually that means we might need to make that either more efficient, and if it's a steam system, and the chances are we're going to have to de-steam the site as well. Now we're talking about spending lots more capital. So we're well over double where we were. We're now at about £266 per tonne per megawatt. So heat pumps, you can see, are potentially solutions that gradually more expensive, the more complicated, and the more stuff we have to do to try and make them work. What else have we got in our palette of decarbonising solutions? Well, increasingly now we're looking at deep geothermal. Deep geothermal is the exciting opportunity, and I think we've seen a few presentations in the last couple of days around deep geothermal. Now this is a solution that would require you to drill down, usually at least 2 kilometres, maybe more, below the Earth's surface and pull out some hot water. And hopefully that water is hot enough that we can use it directly into our heating systems. And crucially, we're not going to be using as much electricity as we would have been using if we'd used an air source heat pump, for example. So, but even so, you are talking about, with deep geothermal schemes, quite a big capital outlay. And it's quite a range, because it depends a lot on risk and where that risk is placed. So you can see, even with this solution, I'm still probably going to be somewhere around the £300 per tonne as a minimum. Now then, with deep geothermal, it also depends on how hot the water you put out to the ground. So it might even mean that you have to top the heat up with a heat pump. So our friendly old heat pump has now appeared on the screen again, and that heat pump adds more capital, but our water wasn't as hot as it was in the previous example. So we're actually going to have to spend some more energy to top that water temperature up so that we can use it in our hospital. And depending on how big that heat pump is, we might even end up having to uprate our electrical supply as well. So now you can see that the capital value and the investment per tonne of carbon is increasing even more. What else have we got? So we've talked about hydrogen a lot, and hydrogen is as I'll explain in a while, is a potential solution for some sites. And if hydrogen can be used in a similar way, in other words, we get piped hydrogen coming up to the site, we could potentially run a reciprocating gas engine that runs on the hydrogen and won't emit the CO2 whilst using the hydrogen, but could generate now a revenue stream, which means that we get some heat and power from the hydrogen, and it should now start to be making positive savings in the same way as we were used to seeing with natural gas. Now this is on the basis that we get the hydrogen at the same sort of price per kilowatt hour that we would be getting for natural gas. And that is potentially possible if that hydrogen meets the government's proposed hydrogen standard. They will subsidise the price per kilowatt hour for the natural gas, for the hydrogen. Okay. And who knows, if we have enough hydrogen, maybe we could run some boilers off of that as well. Now, other options might be, particularly if we're not anywhere near hydrogen, to look at district heat connection. And district heat connection, again, will be dependent on where your hospital is in relation to perhaps other big energy users. And those can show quite good levels of return. They can certainly get somewhere near positive. But again, it really does depend on what you need to do on your side of the connection to that district heat scheme. Most district heat schemes are going to be looking at specific criteria for the heat that they deliver to you at a certain temperature, and they'll be wanting you to make sure that you return the water back to them, i.e. where you haven't used that heat, at a maximum temperature. So in order to fulfill that criteria, you might have to spend some money to make your site compatible with the district heat connection, and that's why you can see another range in potential capital that might need to be expended to make a district heat scheme work. So let's look at how these things look when you compare them together. Remember, the things that we're particularly interested in is revenue. In other words, are we actually going to be always at a worse position in terms of how much we're spending day to day on our energy versus the amount of capital that might need to be invested to deliver the carbon savings that we're seeking. So this graph attempts to do this. So you can see as soon as I plot the heat pump options, particularly the air source ones, that we're in, whilst we can potentially get quite a long way along the x-axis in terms of we might need to spend quite a lot of money to save carbon. It looks like we'll always be in a negative revenue position. And if we compare that to the deep geothermal option, we can see that depending on the amount of capital, depending on where you are, there is a potential for us to be looking at a positive positive revenue position. But also, it will depend a lot on drill costs and everything else and where that risk sits. So you can see, there is a chance that it might be negative. And particularly if we have to put heat pumps in to boost that heat, then that makes it less likely to be a positive revenue generator. So the hydrogen fueled CHP is showing a positive revenue, a very good positive revenue, because it's generating electricity on a cost of hydrogen that is pegged against the cost of natural gas. And there is, as we shall see, a big difference between those two values. So we know we can generate positive revenues. And indeed, if we ran a boiler, we would get a similar position, because we would get the carbon savings now at a cost comparable with running it on natural gas. And district heat, again, should normally be, there should be a positive position there, but that's at risk of turning negative or perhaps even neutral, depending on the amount that you might need to do to invest in your site to work with the district heat scheme. So we've talked about hydrogen, which sounds absolutely fantastic, but hydrogen will depend, initially at least, on where you're located in the hospital, in the country. So the map there is showing where the developing hydrogen hubs are up and down the UK. If you're right in the centre, access to hydrogen might not come until a bit later. And this graph is showing, it's from the UK government's hydrogen strategy, and it's showing the predicted sort of rollout of hydrogen and the proportion of final energy consumption that perhaps it might achieve with hydrogen by 2050. You see that really nothing much is going to happen until we hit the early 2030s. And that's when the first projects of hydrogen networks start to roll out. What about geothermal? Well, geothermal is also pretty dependent on where you are in the country. So the map here is showing a heat gradient, and you can see that up in the northeast and some parts of the northwest and down in the south, where it's red or orange, the likelihood of us getting higher temperature heat is higher. So that means the higher the temperature heat, as we have seen, the more likely we are to have a positive revenue producing solution. Now that heat map is showing that, you know, that at the depth of a kilometre, we might, in the best case, be getting temperatures of around 50 to 60 degrees C. And for each further kilometre that you drill, you might be able to elevate that by another 20 degrees C on top. But obviously that comes with more drill cost. What about district heat? Well, district heat is another one of those things where location is quite important. But for hospitals, in most instances, hospitals are located in urban environments. So they do act as a very good anchor load for district heat schemes. The map there is showing the potential density of those sorts of schemes across the UK. Now, district heat to date has relied quite heavily on funding from the government through the Green Heat Network Fund. And that's basically, we've got a sort of guarantee on that for drawdowns up until I think around about 2027, 2028. Not quite sure what's going to happen after that, but you can see that the idea is we needed that funding to start to boost solutions, to start increasing the likelihood of those occurring. But I don't think necessarily the Green Heat Network Fund is going to be something that we can rely on perhaps in the slightly longer term now. So where does that leave our humble heat pump? If you're not in a geothermal favourable location, or you are not going to be in the first wave of hydrogen rollout, what can we do? I mean, heat pumps do have some really good things going for them, because they are basically nice little boxes that we can place relatively easily on our sites. So the thing about heat pumps is how well we can, or how efficient we can make them. If we can make them very efficient, then that revenue, that negative revenue position that I was showing you earlier, can potentially go down. We can hopefully get somewhere towards at least a revenue neutral position. So here's a scheme that the CEF were involved with, the Bridlington Hospital, which has a 600 kilowatt heat pump and a 750 kilowatt solar PV array. The graph along the top is from our continuous monitoring facility that we have on the site, and the trust can look up at any time. It has day+1 performance data on it in real time. And when you actually plot that performance of the heat pump out for the year, you might be able to spot that towards the left-hand side, we've got the wiggly line, which is the coefficient of performance, how efficient that heat pump is. That's just about getting towards a COP of 3. But on average, across the year, the COP is about 2. So that means that for every 2 kilowatts of heat I get out, I'm going to have to put 1 kilowatt of electricity in. And what we find with heat pumps is that the the difference between the COP is really important. This graph is showing you that as my COP falls down towards 1, the gap between the cost of running that heat pump versus the cost of running a boiler, which is the orange horizontal line, is going to increase. What you actually need to do is get it further and further up the graph. And you can see on this particular example, the neutrality was around was having a COP of around 3.25. At that point, we know that the cost of running that heat pump is going to be equal to the cost of running the natural gas. Now that figure might change from site to site depending on how hot you need the water out of the heat pump and depending how efficient your gas boilers were. But trying to get efficiency from heat pumps is key. What about if we've managed to do as good a scheme as we possibly can, but we're still in this position where it's going to cost us to run that heat pump? Now, as I've mentioned, the problem here is the disparity between the cost of electricity and the cost of natural gas. And the main reason for that is that electricity at the moment has a lot of add-on bits. So you can see I've circled the wholesale cost of a typical electricity tariff. That's about 34% of the total tariff that you pay for electricity, which means there's about 65% of your cost of electricity hasn't anything really to do with the price you're paying for that electricity on the wholesale market. So what we end up then is a position where electricity is somewhere between 3.5 and 4 times the cost of gas. But the wholesale price of electricity, so if it was 18p at 34%, it might be around about 6.5 pence to the whole wholesale price. That's not a million miles away from the cost of gas. Is there anything we can do about our cost of electricity? Well, increasingly we're now getting into a electricity market that is a lot more volatile than it once was, because it's now relying a lot more on renewables to deliver the market price of electricity. And what we find when we look at the day-to-day cost of electricity, so it's a bit like the stock exchange, or probably a lot worse. If you bid to buy some electricity on one day, you could be paying 30% more than the day before. And that's because it really depends on how much wind is currently generating, how much other renewables are currently on the national grid at any one time. I have a domestic tariff where from time to time my electricity supply company says, tomorrow or at the weekend, we're not charging you for any electricity. You can fill your boots because it's zero. And that's because they've purchased ahead on the electricity market at very cheap rates. And they know that in order to take advantage of the next day, they're going to need to be making some headroom for more energy purchase. So this sort of flexibility in energy marketing and energy purchase is becoming more and more prevalent. And when you start to run some numbers through what we call a dynamic purchase, so this would be perhaps day ahead purchasing on the market, you can see that over the year, depending on the amount of risk that you want to take, in other words, how much of your electricity purchase you're prepared to buy on a day ahead basis, you start to see some improvements on those revenue gaps for in particular heat pumps. Now, there are other ways of perhaps getting some assurity or stability on electricity purchase. Obviously, buying ahead, a day ahead, is a risky business, and it's not necessarily something that NHS trusts want to be involved with. You might have heard of sleeving and power purchase agreements. So here we're talking about an investment in some renewable energy. It's probably going to be renewable energy somewhere off-site. It might be that you've got some land on your site, and perhaps you elect to invest in that and feed through to the grid and try and sell your power direct on the grid. But that's unlikely. It's more likely that you would be any form of renewables that you build yourself on site, you want to connect directly to your usage. But what if you haven't got all those roofs that we were looking at on the previous presentation available for solar PV, or you're a very big site with large demands of power? You will need to invest perhaps in something off-site. And that's what a sleeved solution allows you to do. It allows you to make an investment off-site in a renewables project, and in so doing, the amount of electricity that renewable projects delivers onto the grid will replace that wholesale price that we were looking at earlier. Now, you've made that investment, you know what the returns on that investment are, and you know what that renewables project is going to deliver over its price. So you've now got some form of assurity on your proportion of wholesale price. So no matter what happens on the market, generally, if we have another war in the Gulf or something like that and electricity prices go up again, your price that you've invested in for your piece of renewable energy scheme, that remains solid because you've made that investment. That's not going to change. And that's the advantage that a PPA style agreement will give you. It gives you some form of stability on price. So again, looking at how that might play out on a typical scheme, we can see, depending on the level of investment, and remember, the investment level doesn't necessarily have to constitute to the whole of your energy usage. We can actually draw a ring around that to maybe just deal with the amount of electricity you need to use for your project, your heat pump project. And we can see that there's potential, depending on the value of that investment, to get an improvement on revenue, somewhere between 20 and 40%. What does that do to that that heat pump solution? Now we've managed to move up the graph a bit, and we're knocking on the door of cost neutrality. It depends, obviously, on lots of things, and I've been quite conservative here. But we can see that there is a potential to do something like that. In fact, if you were to put that renewable electricity, the power purchase agreement, or the dynamic purchasing through your heat pump, you could also put it through your geothermal solution, so you'd actually get that start to look a lot more healthy as well. In fact, anything that requires electricity to be used to generate carbon savings could adopt that sort of strategy. There is already a document that is in place, the framework agreement with the NHS, that does cover PPAs and a certain amount of risk management with dynamic purchasing, but that's limited to a degree. So we need to understand how that might work on a scheme. I'm realising my time is probably up, so I'm going to skip these slides a little bit faster. In terms of electrical capacity, we were worried about having to invest a lot on the capacity of the electricity needed for heat pumps. We can look at operating heat pumps outside of the maximum demand. We've been looking at that on some schemes, and we can see there's headroom that you might be able to operate heat pumps in without necessarily having to take on additional maximum demand. In order to do that, we might need to invest in batteries, electric batteries, and maybe thermal stores. We have a couple of schemes that have done that. The price of batteries is going down at quite a rate. So we see batteries as perhaps being something that is going to be used more and more often. If we marry all these things together, we start to get a solution that takes on board available storage technology. It takes on board the ability to purchase strategically the energy that we use. We can wrap the risk of some of the risk of doing that around a services style agreement, which then can start to guarantee heat within the level of risk that you're prepared to work with, and but it starts to become a lot more affordable. And this is probably where things are going, because the market is definitely becoming more and more dynamic, and solutions need to respond to that. But they need to wrap the risk away from trusts so that they're handled by the experts. So in summary, if we have something that's too expensive, we feel that's too expensive, we aren't getting any free money, we need to look at ways, firstly, of ensuring the efficiency of plant, but secondly, we need to be looking at the energy use and how we can make best use of that emerging market of dynamism and PPAs, etc. And we also need to look at how we manage the operation of that plant through strategic use of storage, whether that's electric or thermal. I apologise, it's gone slightly longer than I'd hoped, and I hope I'm not too much over time, but if anybody does have any questions they would like to ask, please feel free.
I've got one, Stephen.
Yes?
Yesterday, Andy Yates talked about the Countess of Chester and how the deep geothermal is revenue positive over its life. Your graph is showing that deep geothermal is on the cusp.
My graph is showing a sort of a cusp versus, it's on a line. So we might find situations where we have some funding, and I think we've got some level of funding from PSDS on the Countess scheme that's helping to make that scheme as a whole more positive. All of the examples I've shown you don't include any PSDS, because there is no PSDS going forward. So this is why I'm pushing, what I'm saying to you here is, if we don't have any free money from the government, we have to look other ways of trying to get to solutions that try and get us at least to a neutral position, ideally positive. But if someone's got free money, then great, that's going to make that look a lot better.
But schemes can be looked at on a scheme-by-scheme basis, can't they? And they'll all have their different...
They will all have, those graphs are generic. I've tried to take out some of the inferences, but this is true. There's no such thing as a typical scheme. Most schemes have things happening on them, or situations that sort of drive costs one way or the other, which is why we need to always look with an open mind on what's available and what works best.
Thank you for that. That was really insightful for me to see some of the thinking, because that's, I see it interesting, and that's definitely some of the thinking that we've got around how we start to dynamically buy energy and the role that PPA will play in the longer term to kind of reduce that OpEx risk. But I wondered why you didn't include demand management in your analysis, because as you said, it is on a case-by-case basis. When you look at our full-step investment plan and our net return plan, we think 50% of our opportunity is just in energy efficiency.
Yes.
That's not incorporated within that. Just what role do you think that will play in that?
With all the schemes that CEF does, it always has a proportion of demand management, and that's how we've always traditionally delivered schemes. So we will always have, in the early days, it was usually we'll have a big lighting scheme where we'll replace all the lightings. When we first started doing these, it was we'll replace T8 fluorescence with T5 fluorescence. Well, now of course we're working with LEDs, and in fact most trusts now have made massive inroads into their their lighting infrastructure, and most trusts have a good proportion, if not all of it, converted to LEDs. But there may be, there are other demand side reduction measures that can take place. And whilst I was sort of rushing my way towards the finish line earlier, I did rather skip over this slide, which is trying to manage demand so that you can actually operate things like heat pumps without having to necessarily go for a full-scale grid upgrade. I granted that might still limit the size of the heat pump that you could actually install, but on this example that we were looking at, we had at least a 400 kilowatt headroom, and depending on how you manage other stuff on the site, that could be even more. And 400 kilowatts will get you somewhere towards a megawatt's worth of heat pump. So yeah, it's demand side is very important.
You call if you're the best cost saving options that you have 10 years down the line, the customer decide they want to subsidise it.
Okay, so yes, this is the thing about government subsidies. They're there to start a market. They're there to encourage an industry and a solution to happen. And this happened with wind energy. You know, it was very, very heavily subsidised 20 or so years ago, and now the market is the wind generation market is very mature. It doesn't need subsidy. In fact, it's a very cost-effective way of delivering renewable energy, and I think this is the plan behind hydrogen. To start with, it's expensive, it's risky, it needs government support to get it going. Yes.
Any more questions?
There's another section of solutions, a lot of that to use the tax and weight electricity onto gas.
Yes, that's a very good question, and it is something that a lot of, including the CEF, we have been involved in consultations on this, and as we were looking at on that slide, there are a lot of add-ons for electricity. As far as I'm aware, there are no plans to move, not even CCL, in broad terms, to take that away from electricity. Now, that might change in the future. I know, for example, you can see there's quite a big share there, 20% for the renewables obligation. That is something that's sitting on the electricity tariff and is part of that subsidy I was talking about for wind turbines. Now, that subsidy is due to finish, I think, in 2037. I think so. In theory, that would disappear. But I think the government's trying to play quite a tricky card here, because it can't be seen to immediately throw a lot of tax onto natural gas, because that will immediately impact industry, and industry isn't currently ready to suddenly see 30-40% more costs on natural gas that are, in effect a tax, and would impact a lot on lots of things, everything that in fact we make or produce in the UK.